A cry across the void. The galaxy was old, far older than most species could truly understand. And in all its long and tangled history, the one rule that every civilization agreed upon was simple. Survival meant staying quiet, staying careful, and never ever making enemies you could not handle. The Galactic Concord had stood for over 3,000 years as the great alliance of spacefaring species, a fragile web of diplomacy and trade that held more than 4,000 civilizations together through shared fear and shared interest. It was not a perfect system, but it worked well enough, as long as everyone played by the rules and nobody pushed too hard. Among those rules, written and unwritten, there was one that every ambassador learned on their very first day at Concord Central. Do not anger a Deathworld species, and above all, do not provoke the humans. Humanity had arrived on the galactic stage barely 40 years ago, and in that short time, they had already become the most whispered about species in every corridor and council chamber. They came from Earth, a planet officially classified as a Class 12 death world, a place where the gravity was punishing. The atmosphere was a toxic cocktail of nitrogen and highly reactive oxygen. The weather could kill in minutes, and the creatures that lived there had spent billions of years locked in an endless war of predator and prey. The humans themselves were the survivors of all of that. Endurance predators who could chase prey for hours without stopping, who healed from wounds that would kill most aliens, who bonded emotionally with anything and everything around them, and who had clawed their way to the top of their planet's food chain through sheer stubbornness and an almost frightening refusal to die. The Concord had granted humanity provisional membership, mostly because the alternative, leaving them outside the alliance where no one could watch them, was considered far more dangerous. But for all the fear they inspired, the humans had been remarkably quiet. They traded fairly, they honored agreements, they kept to themselves, and they smiled too much, which many species found unsettling for reasons they could not quite explain. All of that changed on a cold and unremarkable day at Concord Central, when a signal cut through every communication channel in the station like a scream through silence. It was a distress call, raw and unencrypted, and broadcast on every frequency at once, breaking every rule of diplomatic protocol. The voice belonged to Ambassador Velshari of the Veltari, an elderly diplomat from an aquatic species known for their bioluminescent skin and their gentle, peaceful nature. Her voice shook as she spoke, and the light patterns on her skin, visible even through the low-quality transmission, flickered in wild, desperate colors that any translator could read as pure terror. She begged for help. Her colony world, Rethan 4, had been attacked and blockaded by the Kyre Dominion, a militaristic insectoid empire that had abandoned the Concord decades ago and had since carved a brutal path across the outer territories. The Kyre were strip-mining the planet's oceans, enslaving the Veltari population, and dragging families from their homes. The footage that accompanied the distress call showed Kyre soldiers pulling Veltari children from flooded shelters, while their parents screamed in colors too bright to look at. The Concord Council convened within the hour, and the debate that followed was as predictable as it was painful. The Drelith hegemony, ancient and proud, expressed sympathy but declined to act, citing the risk to their own border territories. The Alari Federation ran simulations and concluded that any military intervention had a less than 12% chance of success against the Kyre's superior numbers. The Scythery Collective, a hive mind species that processed decisions through billions of linked minds, simply stated that the cost-benefit analysis did not support engagement. One by one, every species offered words of concern and gestures of regret, and one by one, every species said no. Captain Alara Vasquez watched the entire debate from the human embassy's observation gallery, her arms crossed and her dark eyes fixed on the main display screen where the distress call footage played on a loop. She was the human military attaché at Concord Central, a decorated officer with 15 years of service and a reputation for calm under pressure. She was not calm now. The footage showed a Veltari child, barely old enough to swim on their own, being shoved into a containment field by a Kai soldier 3 times their size. The child's skin flickered a dim, terrified blue, and then went dark, a sign, Vasquez knew, of total emotional shutdown. She turned away from the screen, walked to her secure terminal, and opened a direct channel to Solcom, Solar Command, back on Earth. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Within the hour, the orders were signed. Within 2 hours, crews across human-controlled space were being pulled from leave and recalled to their ships. Within 4 hours, fuel lines were connecting to reactors, and munitions were being loaded into magazines. Within 6 hours, a response time that would later become infamous across the galaxy, Earth's United Naval Command authorized full fleet deployment under the designation Operation Bright Tide. Captain Vasquez received the confirmation on her terminal and let out a slow breath. She looked at the distress call footage one more time, at the child whose light had gone dark, and she whispered a single word that the translator could not pick up. She then sent a formal notification to the Concord Council, as protocol required, informing them that humanity would be responding to the Veltari distress call with military force. The notification was polite, brief, and terrifying in its simplicity. It did not ask for permission. It did not request support. It simply informed the Concord that the 7th Expeditionary Fleet was being deployed, and that all civilian traffic should clear the transit corridors between Sol and the Rithon system immediately. The reaction at Concord Central was instant and electric. Diplomats flooded the corridors, their voices a chaos of languages and frequencies. Intelligence officers scrambled to confirm what their sensors were already telling them. Massive energy signatures were igniting across human space. FTL drives spinning up, one after another, in a chain reaction of power and purpose. The numbers climbed, 20 ships, then 40, then 80, then past 100, and still rising. The Olari ambassador, a small feathered being named Tavan, who had always considered herself brave, stood at an observation window and watched the data scroll across her personal display. Her feathers flattened against her body, an involuntary fear response she could not control as she read the fleet composition. Dreadnoughts, carriers, destroyers, assault transports, electronic warfare cruisers. This was not a rescue mission. This was a full-scale war fleet, the kind of force that could crack open a planetary defense grid and not even slow down. She turned to a colleague and asked a question that was on every mind in the station. What have the humans done in 6 hours that we could not do in 6 centuries? No one had an answer. Across the galaxy, sensors watched, and communication channels went quiet, one by one, as every species turned its attention toward the same impossible sight. The wolves of Earth were moving, and the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath. Ambassador Velshari, still hiding in her flooded bunker on Rithon 4, with the sounds of here patrols echoing above her, did not know any of this yet. She had sent her cry into the void, and had expected nothing in return, because the galaxy had taught her long ago that no one comes when you scream. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The wolves are running. The first ships of the human 7th Expeditionary Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at Rally Point Sigma, a cold and empty stretch of space that had been chosen for one reason. It was exactly 14 hours from the Rethon system at maximum FTL speed, and it gave the fleet just enough time to form up before the final jump. They came in waves, and the sight of it was something that the few alien observers who witnessed it would never forget. The destroyer wolf packs arrived first, lean and scarred ships that traveled in groups of 4 and 5, their hulls painted with kill markings and unit insignia that looked more like war paint than military designation. Behind them came the cruisers, heavy and bristling with weapons arrays, their electronic warfare suites already humming with power. Then the carriers, massive flat-decked vessels that carried hundreds of strike fighters in their bellies like sleeping wasps. And finally, sliding out of FTL with a thunderous ripple of distorted space-time, came the dreadnoughts. There were 4 of them, and they were enormous. The flagship was the UENS Thermopylae, a Leviathan-class dreadnought that stretched nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern. She was not a beautiful ship by any galactic standard. No flowing curves, no elegant design philosophy, no artistic hull plating. She was angular, brutal, and covered in layered armor that had been scorched and dented in previous engagements and deliberately left unrepaired. In human naval tradition, battle scars were not flaws to be fixed, but honors to be worn, and the Thermopylae wore hers like medals. On her bridge, Fleet Admiral Johann Kessler stood with his hands clasped behind his back and watched the fleet assemble on the tactical display. He was a tall man with gray eyes, gray hair cut short, and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone and then weathered by decades of hard use. He was 61 years old, and he had commanded ships in 3 separate conflicts before this one. He spoke rarely, smiled less, and had a reputation throughout the fleet as a man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. "All ships reporting in, Admiral," his executive officer said from the command pit below. "Formation status?" Kessler asked. "Wolf packs are in screening positions. Carriers are launching combat air patrol. The battle line is forming up. We are at 87% fleet readiness and climbing." Kessler nodded once and opened a fleet-wide channel. The communication systems carried his voice to every ship, every deck, every compartment where sailors and marines waited. "This is Admiral Kessler," he said, and his voice was calm and even and carried no emotion that anyone could grab onto. "In 14 hours, we will arrive at the Rethan system. There are people down there who called for help, and we are going to give it to them. Section commanders will distribute tactical briefings within the next 2 hours. Know your roles, trust your training, and take care of each other. That is all." He closed the channel, and the bridge was quiet for a moment before the organized chaos of pre-battle preparation resumed. Far below the bridge, in the marine berthing compartments of the assault transport UENS Guadalcanal, the men and women of the 12th Orbital Assault Division were preparing in their own way. Sergeant First Class Marcus Cole sat on his bunk and field-stripped his rifle for the 3rd time that day. Not because it needed cleaning, but because the repetitive motion kept his hands busy and his mind focused. Around him, Marines checked their powered exoskeletal armor, tested communication gear, sharpened combat knives with slow and deliberate strokes, and talked in the easy, dark-humored way that soldiers had talked before battles since the beginning of human history. "I heard the Kair have 300 ships," a young corporal said from across the compartment. "Good," a staff sergeant replied without looking up from her equipment check. "More targets, less searching." Laughter rippled through the compartment, and Cole allowed himself a small grin. He had been in combat before, and he knew the laughter was as much medicine as it was humor. It kept the fear in its cage, kept the hands steady, kept the mind from wandering to the dark places where a soldier could get lost. On the wall beside his bunk, someone had taped a drawing, a child's crayon picture of a stick figure in green armor standing next to a yellow sun, with the words, "Come home safe, Daddy," written in uneven letters across the top. Cole looked at it for a long moment, then went back to his rifle. Liaison Officer Tivon of the Olari Federation had been assigned to the fleet as an official Concord observer, a role that had seemed like a routine diplomatic posting when she had accepted it 3 months ago, and now felt like a death sentence. She was a small, feathered being, with large amber eyes, and a nervous habit of preening her crest feathers when she was anxious. and she had not stopped preening since the fleet began assembling. She walked through the Thermopolis corridors and tried to make sense of what she was seeing. These humans were about to go to war, about to throw themselves against a force that outnumbered them more than 2-1. And they did not seem afraid. They seemed focused, yes, and serious, yes. But underneath all of that, there was something else. Something that made Tivan's feathers press flat against her skull, in an instinctive prey response she could not override. They were eager. Not bloodthirsty, not savage, not cruel, but eager in the way that a hunting predator is eager when it catches a scent. A coiled energy that vibrated beneath their calm surfaces and flickered in their eyes when they thought no one was watching. Tivan had studied human biology as part of her diplomatic training, and she knew the science. Elevated heart rates, increased adrenaline production, heightened sensory awareness, the full activation of a predatory nervous system that had been refined by millions of years of evolution on a world that killed everything that was not strong enough or fast enough or smart enough to survive. She watched a group of Marines laugh over a shared meal in the mess hall, their massive bodies relaxed and their strange flat teeth tearing into food that Tivan's species would have classified as mildly toxic. And she understood with sudden and terrible clarity that she was not on a warship. She was inside a predator, and it was waking up. That evening, she sat alone in her assigned quarters and quietly updated her will. At the edge of the Rathan system, the Kyre Dominion blockade fleet held its position around the conquered world. 312 warships, arranged in a layered defensive formation, with Warlord Skethvan's massive command ship, the Ironclaw, sitting at the center like a spider in its web. Skethvan was an old warrior, his chitinous exoskeleton scarred from dozens of campaigns, his compound eyes cold and calculating. He had received the intelligence reports about the incoming human fleet, and he had dismissed them with a clicking sound that served as laughter among his kind. "Soft world primates," he said to his war council. "They are outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting far from their home territory. They will realize their mistake and withdraw before they ever reach weapons range." The senior advisor, a quieter and more cautious insectoid named Kethra, did not share his confidence. Kethra had read the classified Concord files on humanity, the ones that most species preferred not to think about. And what she had read kept her awake during rest cycles. She said nothing to Skethvan, because challenging the warlord openly was a good way to lose one's head. But she quietly began transferring non-essential personnel to transports at the rear of the formation. When Skethvan asked her why, she simply said it was a routine logistics adjustment. She did not tell him that she was giving those people a chance to run. 14 hours later, the human fleet dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Rathan system. 142 warships running hot, every weapon charged, every shield at full power, broadcasting on an open channel that every ship in the system and every intelligence agency in the galaxy could hear. Admiral Kessler's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Kyre Dominion Forces, this is Fleet Admiral Johann Kessler of the United Earth Navy. You have 1 standard hour to withdraw from Rathan 4 and release all Veltari captives. This is not a negotiation." The transmission ended, and the galaxy held its breath. Deathworlders at war. The hour passed in silence, and the Kyre Dominion did not move. Warlord Skethvan stood at the center of the Ironclaw's command deck and watched the human fleet on his tactical display with the cold patience of a predator who believed he was the largest thing in the room. His fleet outnumbered the humans more than 2-1. His ships were fresh and fully supplied, and he held the high orbital ground above Rathan 4. By every calculation his war council had run, the advantage was overwhelmingly his. When the hour expired, he opened a channel to the human flagship. "You are brave, little mammals," he said, his translator converting the clicking sounds of his language into flat, emotionless words. But bravery is not enough. Withdraw now, and I will let you leave with your ships intact. Stay, and I will add your bones to my collection. Admiral Kessler did not respond. Instead, the communication officer on the Thermopylae bridge simply closed the channel, and Kessler looked at his tactical officer and said 2 words: "Execute, bright tide." Across the fleet, those words traveled at the speed of light, and 142 ships surged forward as one. The Kyre had expected caution. They had expected the humans to probe their formation, to test for weaknesses, to maneuver for advantage the way every other species in the galaxy fought. Carefully, methodically, with retreat plans built into every tactical program. What they got instead was something that no species in the Concord had ever seen in a fleet engagement. The humans charged straight at them. The destroyer wolf packs hit first, 4 ships moving in perfect coordination as if they shared a single mind, their torpedo launchers firing in synchronized spreads that tore into the outer layer of the Kyre formation. The explosions bloomed in the vacuum like flowers of light, and before the debris had even begun to drift, the destroyers were already through the gap and racing toward the next target. The Kyre responded with overwhelming firepower, hundreds of ships turning their weapons on the advancing human fleet and filling the space between them with a wall of energy and metal. It was the kind of barrage that should have stopped any attack cold, that should have shattered hulls and broken formations and sent the survivors scattering. The human ships flew straight into it. Their armor held. It buckled and burned and cracked in places, but it held, because human ships were not built like other ships in the galaxy. They were built by a species that had evolved on a world where everything was trying to kill them, a species that designed their technology the same way they designed their bodies, to take punishment that would destroy anything else and keep going. The hulls were layered with redundant armor plating. The internal systems were compartmentalized so that damage to one section could not cascade to others. And every critical component had a backup, and every backup had a backup. The dreadnoughts led the charge, and the Thermopylae was at the front, her massive frame absorbing hit after hit as she plowed forward like a battering ram. Kyre gunners poured everything they had into her, and warning lights flashed across her bridge as armor plates failed and secondary systems went offline. But she did not slow down, and she did not turn aside. On the bridge, Kessler stood exactly where he had been standing when the battle began, his hands clasped behind his back, his gray eyes moving across the tactical display with the calm focus of a man who had done this before. "Wolfpack Bravo, collapse their left flank," he said. "Carrier Group, launch all remaining strike wings. I want their sensor ships blind in the next 4 minutes." The orders went out, and the fleet responded with a speed and precision that stunned the Kyre commanders. The electronic warfare cruisers activated their full suites, flooding Kyre communication and targeting systems with so much interference that their ships began firing blind, hitting empty space, and sometimes hitting each other. The human fighter-bomber wings poured from the carriers in swarms, small and fast, and piloted by beings who could withstand gravitational forces that would crush the pilots of any other species, executing turns and rolls that the Kyre's own fighters simply could not match. In the chaos, the Kyre formation began to fracture. The disciplined crescent that Skethvon had arranged so carefully broke into clusters of ships fighting their own separate battles. And the hive-linked communication system that the Kyre relied on was overwhelmed with conflicting orders and panicked status reports. Kessler saw the fracture on his display and gave the order he had been waiting to give. "All dreadnoughts, execute hammer and anvil. Split their formation down the center." The 4 human dreadnoughts drove forward in a wedge, their combined firepower concentrated on a single point in the Kyre line, and the line broke. The Kyre fleet was cut in 2, each half suddenly unable to coordinate with the other, and for the first time in the battle, Kai ships began to turn away. They were retreating. But the battle was not only in space. While the fleet tore the Kai formation apart above, the assault transports made their move, protected by a screen of destroyers that took hits meant for the vulnerable troop carriers. 6 transports dove toward Rethan 4's atmosphere, their hulls glowing red as they punched through at combat speed. Inside the UEN's Guadalcanal, Sergeant Cole and the Marines of the 12th Orbital Assault Division sat strapped in their drop harnesses, their powered armor sealed and pressurized, their weapons loaded and locked. The transport shook violently as anti-aircraft fire from ground-based Kyr positions hammered the hull, and the interior lights flickered between white and emergency red. 30 seconds to dirt, the dropship pilot called over the intercom, her voice steady, despite the fact that 2 of their escort ships had just taken critical hits. The ramp dropped, and the Marines hit the ground running, literally running, in gravity that was 1.3 times Earth standard, wearing armor that weighed as much as some alien species, carrying weapons and ammunition and medical supplies across broken terrain under active enemy fire. The Kyr ground forces had expected the atmospheric entry and the landing to weaken the humans, to slow them down, to give the defenders time to set up killing zones. They were wrong. The humans moved through the heavy gravity as if it were nothing, because to them it was barely noticeable. They had trained in worse conditions, fought in worse conditions, lived their entire evolutionary history in conditions that the galaxy considered a death sentence. The toxic rain that fell on parts of the battlefield, laced with chemicals from the Kyr mining operations, would have incapacitated most species. The humans simply sealed their helmets and kept advancing. Sergeant Cole's squad pushed through a destroyed Veltari settlement, stepping over rubble that had once been homes, and he could see the containment fields ahead, where the Kyr were holding captive Veltari. The Kyr soldiers guarding the camp saw the humans coming and opened fire, and Cole felt rounds impact his chest plate hard enough to stagger him, but the armor held, and he kept moving. They reached the camp in 12 minutes. It took them another 8 to clear it. The Kyr guards fought hard, because the insectoids were warriors, and they did not surrender easily. But they were fighting something they had never encountered before, an enemy that did not stop when wounded, that did not freeze when afraid, that kept pushing forward with a relentless, grinding determination, that was less like a military assault and more like a force of nature. When the last Kyr guard fell, Sergeant Cole moved through the containment fields, cutting them open one by one, and the Veltari inside stared up at him with wide, luminous eyes, their skin flickering with colors he could not read. He found the bunker where Ambassador Velshari had been hiding, a flooded underground chamber where she had spent days in darkness, listening to the sounds of her people being taken. The door was sealed, and Cole had to use a breaching charge to open it. The blast echoed through the chamber, and when the water and dust settled, he stood in the doorway, water pouring off his scarred and dented armor, his rifle in one hand, and the other held out, palm open and empty. "You called," he said, his translator converting the words into the musical language of the Veltari. "We came. Let us get you out of here." Ambassador Velshari looked at this enormous, terrifying creature from a death world, standing in the ruins of her shelter with his hand extended, and her skin blazed a color that meant something beyond words, relief and gratitude, and a sorrow so deep it had no name. She took his hand. Above the planet, the space battle ended not with a dramatic final explosion, but with a slow collapse. The Kyr fleet, split and blinded and hammered from every direction, broke apart ship by ship as captains made the individual decision to flee rather than die. Warlord Skethvon's Iron Claw was the last to fall, boarded by human assault teams who fought their way through the corridors of his flagship in brutal close-quarters combat that lasted nearly 2 hours. They found Skethvon in his command chamber, alone, his war council having either fled or died. He looked at the humans who came through the door, and saw in their eyes something he had never seen in all his years of conquest. Not hatred, not cruelty, but a cold and absolute purpose that had no room for mercy and no interest in negotiation. They took him alive, because Admiral Kessler had ordered it, and because the humans understood something that Skethvon never had. That killing an enemy was easy, but making them answer for what they had done required the harder discipline of restraint. The Battle of Rethon 4 lasted 11 hours from the first shock to the last surrender. The Kyre Dominion lost 214 ships and their entire ground force. The humans lost 19 ships and 412 sailors and marines. And across the galaxy, every species that had been watching, and they had all been watching, sat in stunned and absolute silence. What have we invited in? The silence lasted for 3 days. Across the galactic concord, in embassy halls and intelligence centers, and the private chambers of leaders and generals, 4,000 spacefaring civilizations tried to process what they had just witnessed, and most of them found that they simply could not. The tactical recordings had been intercepted by every major intelligence agency in the galaxy, and within hours, they were being replayed on screens and displays from one end of known space to the other. Alien military analysts studied them frame by frame, running calculations and simulations, trying to find the trick, the hidden advantage, the secret technology that had allowed a numerically inferior fleet to annihilate a force more than twice its size in under 12 hours. There was no trick. There was no secret technology. There were only the humans, fighting the way humans had always fought, with speed and fury and a coordinated violence that was not reckless, but precisely the opposite, a controlled and disciplined application of force that was somehow more terrifying than chaos would have been. The reactions across the galaxy were varied, but shared a common thread of deep, fundamental unease. The Draelith hegemony, those ancient and proud reptilians who had considered themselves the galaxy's premier military power for over 1,000 years, held an emergency session of their war council. The session lasted 2 days, and when it ended, the hegemony quietly tripled its border defense budget and began a crash program to redesign their warships. The specifics were classified, but intelligence reports suggested they were trying to copy the human approach to armor layering, with limited success. The Olorari Federation responded with characteristic directness. Their ambassador to Earth delivered a formal diplomatic note that had been carefully worded by the Federation's finest linguists, and that, stripped of its elegant phrasing, essentially said, "We wish to express our profound respect for humanity's capabilities and our sincere desire to maintain the warmest possible relations between our peoples." Several Ulari diplomats privately admitted that the note's original draft had simply read, "Please never be angry with us." The Sithari Collective, a hive mind species that processed information through billions of linked neural networks, experienced something that their scientists later described as a distributed cognitive disruption event, but that everyone else recognized as a species-wide anxiety attack. For nearly 6 hours, Sithari individuals across dozens of worlds stood motionless as their collective mind tried to reconcile what it had seen with its existing models of galactic civilization. When they finally resumed normal function, the collective issued a single statement: "We must recalculate." Smaller species reacted in more practical ways. Within a week of the battle, 14 minor civilizations had sent formal requests to Earth's diplomatic corps asking about mutual defense agreements, reasoning that it was far better to stand beside the Deathworlders than to ever find themselves standing across from them. But the fear, raw, instinctive, and overwhelming, was not the whole story. And what happened next confused the galaxy even more than the battle itself. The human fleet did not leave. After the shooting stopped, and the last Kyre ship either surrendered or fled, the expected move, the move that any other military force in galactic history would have made, was to secure the system, establish a temporary garrison, and withdraw the main fleet. Instead, Admiral Kessler ordered the entire fleet to hold position and shift to what the humans called humanitarian operations. Within hours, the same Marines who had stormed Cairo positions with rifles and grenades were setting up field hospitals on the surface of Rithon 4. Combat medics who had been trained to kill were now treating wounded Veltari civilians, working with alien biology they had barely studied, and improvising solutions with a creativity that left Veltari doctors speechless. Navy engineers who had been repairing battle damage to warships redirected their efforts to the planet below, rebuilding the water purification systems that the Cairo had destroyed, restoring power grids, clearing rubble, and constructing prefabricated shelters from materials carried in the fleet's supply ships. Supply convoys arrived from human space carrying food, medicine, water filtration equipment, and thousands of thermal blankets that had been manufactured for Veltari body temperatures specifically, meaning that someone at Solcom had thought about the comfort of alien refugees while the battle was still being planned. Sergeant Cole, who 3 days earlier had fought his way through a Cairo defensive position and pulled Ambassador Velshari from her flooded bunker, spent an entire afternoon carrying Veltari children on his shoulders from a temporary shelter to a newly repaired aquatic habitat. The children clung to his armor and glowed bright blue, the color of trust and safety. And Cole, this massive, scarred soldier from a world that the galaxy considered a nightmare, moved slowly and carefully so that none of them would fall, and made soft sounds that his translator could not quite capture, but that the children seemed to understand. A Veltari elder watched this and asked a human aid worker how a species that fought with such terrible ferocity could also be so gentle. The aid worker, a young woman from a place called Kenya, thought about it for a moment and said, "We are gentle because we know what it costs when no one is." Liaison Officer Tivon spent the days after the battle moving between the fleet and the surface, gathering information for the report she would submit to the Concord. She was thorough and meticulous, because she was an Olari, and her people valued precision, and what she observed challenged every assumption she had ever held about the universe. She watched a human surgeon operate for 14 hours straight to save a Veltari child with internal injuries from a Cairo stun weapon, refusing to rest even when her hands trembled with exhaustion. She watched a group of human engineers argue passionately about the best way to restore a Veltari coral nursery that had been damaged by mining operations, treating the project with the same intensity they had given to combat preparations. She watched Admiral Kessler himself visit the surface, walking through the refugee camps with no security escort, stopping to speak with Veltari families through his translator, listening to their stories with an expression on his stone-carved face that Tivon had never seen before, and that she finally identified, with some shock, as grief. When she submitted her report to the Concord, she classified it at the highest possible security level, not because it contained military secrets, but because she was afraid of what it would do to the galaxy's understanding of itself. The key passage, which would later be leaked and become the most quoted document in Concord history, read, "The humans are not what we feared. They are something far more complex. They waged war with a ferocity I have never witnessed. And then, with the same hands that broke an empire's fleet, they held dying children and wept. I do not know how to classify this species. I do not believe our frameworks are sufficient." Back at Concord Central, the mood was equally complicated. Captain Elara Vasquez returned to her duties at the human embassy and immediately noticed the change. Alien diplomats, who had once nodded politely in the hallways, now gave her a wide berth, stepping aside as she passed, with a deference that was not quite respect and not quite fear, but something uncomfortable in between. She noticed it, and it stung in a way she had not expected. She was eating alone in a public dining area, the tables around her conspicuously empty, despite the lunch crowd, when she felt something wrap around her leg. She looked down and saw a young Veltari child, one of the refugees who had been brought to the station for medical treatment. The child was small, barely reaching Vasquez's knee, and their skin was glowing a soft, steady blue that pulsed in time with what Vasquez now knew was the Veltari equivalent of a heartbeat. The child looked up at her with enormous dark eyes and made a sound that her translator rendered as "safe person." The hallway had gone completely still. Dozens of alien diplomats and officials stood frozen, watching this small, fragile creature from a gentle world wrap its tentacles around the leg of a human Deathworlder with absolute trust. Vasquez knelt slowly, smiled, and placed her hand gently on the child's head, and the child's glow brightened until it was almost too brilliant to look at. Several watching diplomats looked away, and more than one of them was forced to confront the uncomfortable possibility that everything they thought they knew about humanity, about danger and gentleness, about strength and kindness, about what it truly meant to be civilized, might need to be reconsidered from the very beginning. That evening, Vasquez received word through unofficial channels that the Concord Council had called an emergency closed-door session. The topic on the agenda was listed as the human question, threat assessment and integration, and humanity's official ambassador, Dr. Ades Okonkwo, had not been invited. When Vasquez brought her the news, Okonkwo, a sharp-eyed woman from Lagos, with a doctorate in xenopolitics and a spine made of something considerably harder than steel, simply leaned back in her chair and smiled. "They are afraid," she said. "Good. Afraid people ask important questions. Let them ask. We will be ready with the answers." The wolves guard the flock. The emergency session of the Concord Council began at dawn, station time, in the Grand Assembly Hall, a vast curved chamber designed to accommodate representatives of more than 4,000 species, with atmospheric zones and gravity adjustments and translation systems so complex that simply keeping the room functional required a dedicated team of engineers. On this morning, the chamber was full for the first time in decades, every seat occupied, every delegation present, and the air hummed with the particular kind of tension that only arises when an entire civilization realizes it has been wrong about something fundamental. Ambassador Okonkwo had not been invited. She came anyway. She arrived exactly 30 minutes after the session began, walking through the main entrance with the calm confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. The security officers at the door, a pair of armored Drelith guards, looked at her, looked at each other, and stepped aside without a word. Nobody was willing to physically block a human right now, and Okonkwo knew it, and the Drelith guards knew that she knew it, and everyone silently agreed to pretend that this was perfectly normal. Inside the chamber, the debate was already the most heated in Concord history. The isolationist faction, led by Speaker Vren of the Methali Republic, argued that humanity needed to be contained, restricted to their current territories, denied access to further expansion, monitored and managed like a dangerous element that had accidentally been introduced to a delicate ecosystem. Vren was a tall, thin being, with translucent skin through which his purple circulatory system was visible, and his voice carried the authority of a species that had been part of the Concord since its founding. "We have all seen the recordings," he said, his translator rendering his words in the flat, formal tone of diplomatic galactic standard. "A species that can mobilize a war fleet in 6 hours, that charges into superior numbers without hesitation, that fights with a ferocity we have never encountered. This is not a species we can afford to leave unchecked. What happens when they decide that we are the enemy?" The pragmatist faction, represented by Fleet Commander Drow of the Drelith hegemony, an old soldier who had spent 50 years defending his people's borders, and recognized competence when he saw it, responded with characteristic bluntness. "What happens is that we lose," he said, and the chamber went very quiet. "You all ran the same simulations I did. If the humans decided tomorrow to go to war with the Concord, we would not survive the first month. That is the reality. The question is not whether we can contain them. We cannot. The question is whether we are wise enough to make them our partners rather than our adversaries." The idealist faction, smaller but passionate, pointed to Tivon's report and the humanitarian operations on Rethon 4. They argued that humanity was not a threat to be managed, but an answer to a problem the Concord had been unable to solve for centuries. The problem of civilizations like the Kyer Dominion, predatory empires that preyed on weaker species because they knew the Concord lacked the will to stop them. The debate went back and forth, voices rising and translators struggling to keep up, until the main door opened again, and every eye in the chamber turned to see who had entered. It was Ambassador Velshari. She was still weak from her ordeal on Rethon 4, her bioluminescent skin dimmer than usual, supported on one side by a Veltari aide, and on the other by a human marine, Sergeant Cole, who had apparently been assigned to her personal security detail, and who stood at attention in the doorway like a mountain in combat armor. His face expressionless, and his presence speaking louder than any words could have. Velshari made her way slowly to the speaker's platform. The chamber fell into absolute silence. She was an elder of her people, a diplomat who had served the Concord for 40 years, and she had earned the right to speak in this hall, simply by surviving what no one had come to prevent. "I sent a cry into the void," she said, and her voice was quiet, but carried perfectly in the hushed chamber. Her skin flickered with colors that meant sincerity so deep it bordered on prayer. "I sent it knowing that no one would answer, because that is what the galaxy had taught me, that when the weak call for help, the strong look away. I was wrong, but not because the galaxy has changed. I was wrong because there is a species in this room that never learned the lesson the rest of us accepted long ago." She paused, and her skin blazed with a color that the translators could only render as truth. "The humans came," she said. "They came with fire and fury, and they broke the chains my people wore. And when the fighting was over, they stayed. They held our children, and they healed our wounded, and they wept with us. And I tell you now, with every light in my body, if you turn these people away, you turn away the best of what this galaxy could be." The chamber was silent for a long time after she finished. Ambassador Okonkwo waited until the silence had settled before she rose from the seat she had claimed in the human delegation area, a seat that had been empty because no one had thought to assign one. She walked to the center of the chamber with unhurried steps, her dark eyes moving across the assembled delegations, reading the room the way a master diplomat reads rooms, noting the fear and the hope and the uncertainty in equal measure. "I know what you saw," she began, and her voice was steady and warm and carried no trace of apology. "I know it frightened you. It should have. We are a frightening species. We come from a world that spent 4 billion years trying to kill us. And we survived not because we were the strongest or the fastest, but because we refused, absolutely and completely refused, to give up. On ourselves, on each other, and on anyone we decided was under our protection." She let that settle, then continued. "We did not come to this galaxy to conquer it. We have enough problems of our own. We did not come to rule or to dominate, or to prove that we are superior. We came because we looked up at the stars and we wanted to know who else was out there. And when we found you, all of you, in all your wonderful and terrifying variety, we wanted to be part of something bigger than ourselves." She paused, and when she spoke again her voice was quieter, but somehow more intense. What happened at Rethon 4 was not a demonstration of human power. It was a demonstration of human principle. We heard people screaming for help, and we went, because that is what we do. Not because it was easy, not because it was safe, not because we had anything to gain, but because our entire history, every terrible and beautiful moment of it, has taught us one truth that we hold above all others: that strength without compassion is tyranny, and compassion without strength is surrender. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of species that towered over her, and species that could have crushed her with a thought, and species so alien that they barely registered as life to human senses. "We are offering you a partnership," she said, "not as your masters, and not as your servants, but as your guardians, as the ones who will stand at the edge of the dark, so that you do not have to. We ask only one thing in return. Treat us as equals. Nothing more, nothing less. Take it or leave it. But know that either way, the next time someone sends a distress call, we will answer it. That is not a negotiation. That is a promise." The vote took 2 hours. It was not unanimous, because fear runs deep and trust is slow to build, but it passed by a margin wide enough to be decisive. Humanity was granted full membership in the Galactic Concord, a permanent seat on the Security Council, and the mandate to lead a new rapid response initiative, designed to ensure that what happened to the Valtari would never happen to anyone again. Admiral Kessler learned of the vote aboard the Thermopylae, still orbiting Rethon 4, as reconstruction continued below. He received the news with a nod, and returned to the observation deck, where he stood looking down at the blue-green world that his fleet had fought to save. Tivan found him there, standing alone in the dim light of distant stars. She had requested a permanent assignment to the Human Liaison Program, a decision that had surprised her superiors and herself in equal measure. "Admiral," she said, her feathers settling into the relaxed configuration that meant she was no longer afraid, "may I ask you something?" "Of course," he replied. "During the battle, were you afraid?" Kessler was quiet for a long time, long enough that Tivan wondered if he had heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "Always," he said. "That is the secret, Tivan. We are always afraid. We just decided a long time ago that fear is not a good enough reason to let someone suffer alone." She stood beside him in silence, two beings from two very different worlds, watching the planet turn slowly beneath them. And for the first time since she had boarded a human ship, Tivan did not feel like prey standing next to a predator. She felt like something she had never expected to feel in the company of a Deathworlder. She felt safe. Across the galaxy, in the months that followed, things began to change. The remnants of the Kyre Dominion scattered to the farthest reaches of known space, knowing that any act of aggression would bring a response they could not survive. Piracy along the major trade routes dropped by nearly 80% as word spread that the Deathworlders were watching. Species that had bullied weaker neighbors for generations suddenly found compelling reasons to be diplomatic. And on 100 different worlds, in 100 different languages, parents told their children the story of the day the Valtari called for help, and the humans, the terrifying, impossible, wonderful humans, came running. The galaxy had spent millennia building walls against the dark. Humanity taught them that it was better to light a fire and stand in front of it, teeth bared, daring the dark to come closer.